Thank you for joining us today in City Council chambers. I apologize on behalf of the awkward setup. We're preparing for a naturalization ceremony tomorrow at 1 p.m., so you're welcome to come back if you're interested in participating in that event. Today's hearing is for the Public Service and Transportation Committee. We will be reviewing the proposed update to the Multi-Modal Thoroughfare Plan. It is always my goal to be transparent with residents and provide the opportunity for a constructive dialogue regarding the city's initiatives. The City of Columbus has utilized a thoroughfare plan since the mid-1950s to coordinate planning efforts around streets and transportation. This plan is even more important today as our city continues to grow and develop. The Department of Public Service has prepared an update to the city's thoroughfare plan as part of the city's Connect Columbus Transportation Planning Initiative. The new plan represents a shift toward multimodal transportation options and will be a key tool in advancing the city's goals for improved mobility choices that meet the needs of all of our residents. The thoroughfare plan includes a table and map of key transportation corridors designating necessary minimum right-of-way widths for future improvements. The existing plan has become outdated, and the Connect Columbus planning effort has focused on a new approach to classifying thoroughfare corridors, with the intent of accommodating greater design flexibility, multiple modes of transportation for varying contexts throughout the city, and identifying associated right-of-way needs. Legislation for the thoroughfare plan was introduced for a first reading at City Council this past Monday, July 22nd, and will be voted on for final approval on Monday, July 29th. This afternoon, we will hear a presentation from the department about the plan, and then I will open up the floor for public testimony. First, I would like to introduce Kelly Skoko. Skoko, did I say it right? Been working on it. Deputy Director in the Department of Public Service for some introductory remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Favor. We are very excited to be here tonight to present to you and the public our multimodal thoroughfare plan. It's been a long time in the works. We've had a lot of public input early on, and with the additional planning efforts that's been going on, we wanted to make sure that we did this right and that we incorporated all of the planning efforts that are going on, including Insight 2050 with the Central Ohio Transit Authority's plan. We wanted to do and the next gen plan as well. So today I have with us Justin Goodwin. He is a transportation planning manager with our staff, and Eliza Poindexter as well.
Thanks, Kelly. We have a few slides here. We won't take a long time at the hearing here, but we wanted to provide a little bit of overall context for the Multimodal Thoroughfare Plan. If anybody's looking at the slide and sees MMTP, that stands for Multimodal Thoroughfare Plan, and it's that multimodal piece which is really the new element, as the chair has mentioned. We'll provide some overall context and then explain what the thoroughfare plan is and how it works and how it's changing. So as noted, this is a planning process that has gone on for quite some time, beginning a few years ago actually, and a lot's changed in the world of transportation and here in the city over the past few years. The CODA Next Gen planning process that's looking at high capacity transit corridors, high frequency lines over the next 20 years. We have the Smart Columbus initiative and all of the associated mobility efforts around the Smart Cities program. We have a variety of new mobility options that are emerging into the Columbus market and changing how we think about how we use the right-of-way. New initiatives like the C-Pass, which is increasing transit ridership to downtown, and a variety of other things that are causing us to think differently about how we go about transportation planning in the city here today and looking into the future. And as Kelly mentioned, the Insight 2050 Corridor Concepts project, which was released this spring. And in that larger context, all of those changes are happening as the city grows. I think most people are aware now we're projected to grow by up to 3 million people. Total population as a region by the year 2050. We're adding over 10,000 residents a year just to the city itself. And more people and more jobs means greater demands on our transportation system, more trips, and more needs to move people within the roadways that we have, and thinking about how we use that space as efficiently as possible to get people where they're trying to go. Today, I think most people are aware, most people in the city of Columbus and in the region are commuting by single occupant vehicle, by car. 4 out of every 5 people generally are using an automobile, and we have a lesser percentage using transit or bicycling or other modes, although we are seeing increases in those other modes, and definitely a desire for the ability to use other modes, or at least have the option to use other modes. And interestingly, we have still one of the lower average commute times nationally, about 22 or 23 minutes a day for a morning commute for most people. Or the average commuter, I would say. But as growth has been continuing and we have more people putting demands on the system, there are more people who are also experiencing longer commutes. So this graph is showing in that 30 to 35 minute range, more and more people over the past few years have been experiencing that longer commute. So even though the average commute is still relatively low, I think a lot of people in the city are starting to notice more congestion and experiencing that. And within this context of growth, from the beginning of the Connect Columbus process, there was a focus on this connection between the growth in the land use and population density and the impacts on the transportation system. As we think about the different nodes and corridors where growth is already happening or is likely to happen in the future of the coming decades, and how that fits into our other transportation initiatives with other partners like CODA and their next-gen process, we think about how these two things integrate together. And that really led to the Insight 2050 Corridor Concepts, this study that has looked at 5 potential high-capacity transit corridors throughout the region. They're shown on this slide. And this is really looking at that combination of focusing growth along these corridors and in dense transit-oriented nodes along corridors, and then the transportation mode to move large amounts of people more efficiently along those corridors. And I think it's important to note that these are 5 representative corridors. It's not to suggest these are the only ones that will experience that growth or be a focus for improved transportation options. It's really a model for how we think about using our right-of-way more efficiently and in different ways moving in the future. And there are a variety of benefits that study has highlighted in terms of the economy and equity and access to both jobs and housing. As part of the Connect Columbus planning effort, there are a number of goals that have been the focus over the course of this project, highlighted on this slide. Increasing mode choice, different options for people to meet their needs and not be forced to use only one mode of transportation. Looking at neighborhood vitality, economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, the fiscal health of the city as we maintain the transportation system. And part of that is also recognizing the need for adaptability. As we see these changes in the transportation system, rapid changes that are happening with new technology and new mobility entering the market, we are recognizing that we need to be nimble and to be prepared for things that we don't quite know what's coming, but we know the change is coming. We need to be able to adapt to that. And this is really thinking about transportation in a way that is moving beyond just the idea of moving vehicular traffic, we're moving people in a wide variety of different ways, and that'll look different in different quarters in the city based on the land use context, the densities, and the needs of those different areas within the city. And there are multiple objectives associated with that. So traffic flow is still important as we manage congestion, but safety as well. Access to our greenways and parks and trail system by bike and by walking or other personal mobility devices, increased access to transit, and still balancing the limited right-of-way that we have within the city. And also accommodating those emerging mobility trends and new demands on the street system that we see with, it was only a year ago that we had scooters entering the market, and new things will keep arising, and we need to be able to react to those new demands. And that will influence how we think about street design, reallocating space as we're able, as different demands change, to accommodate different types of vehicles, different modes, maybe at different times of days or in different contexts throughout the city. And so this larger Connect Columbus planning effort is really a multi-phase approach to how we go about planning for our streets, going through the design process, and responding to different demands. So the focus here this evening is the Multi-Modal Thoroughfare Plan, and that's part of a larger transportation policy framework to think about how we respond to these changes. And then there are also follow-on items that we'll be developing and advancing as part of our operating procedures in the Department of Public Service. So looking more closely at our street design, developing advanced guidelines for roadway design, access management to provide access to development in a way that is safe and efficient and having appropriate impacts on the transportation network. And then advancing the next evolution of our active transportation network planning, bicycle planning, the low-stress system to get people around by bike or micro-mobility or shared mobility devices. And then there will be some, as we move across the next year in implementing the thoroughfare plan, there will be some other code housekeeping items working with other departments that we'll bring back to council. In terms of the overall transportation policy, a variety of things that we know as a city and as a department that we'll be focusing on moving into the future. One of those is really recognizing that connection between land use and transportation, and working very closely with the Department of Development as new growth and development continues in the city, especially as we're having urban infill development, placing those increased demands on the transportation system. That's really going to require us to think really hard about how we're allocating space in our rights of way and encouraging people to use other modes in order to minimize those impacts on the roadway network. So part of that is thinking about transportation demand in terms of the impacts on the entire system and making sure that we're providing those options that minimize the amount of congestion on our roadways as people are commuting, leveraging new technologies, whether it's the types of things that are being explored by the Smart Cities Initiative or the private market to increase efficiencies within the system. And focusing on those connections in the multimodal transportation system, that low-stress bicycle and micromobility system, so that people have safe, efficient ways to get around with means other than simply a car. And then part of that is working with all of our regional partners. We're interconnected. It's not just the city, it's our surrounding jurisdictions. We have roadways that go across the region, through the city, into and out of the city, and other partnering cities. Our partners such as MORPC and CODA and various advocacy groups that are interested in improving our transportation system. The partnerships will be important in terms of collaborating, arriving at shared designs for roadways that move through different jurisdictions, and partnering on funding as well. And that's really emphasizing the need to think holistically about street design, advancing our complete streets policies, and making sure that we're accommodating all users in a way that is appropriate to the context of different streets and different neighbors, different neighborhoods, different parts of the city, and looking for different ways that we can secure funding for all of these growing demands on our transportation system. And then finally, making sure that we're updating all of our rules and regulations to accommodate these new demands. And that really brings us to what we're here to focus on today. The Thoroughfare Plan, as I mentioned, there are other follow-on items that we'll be developing within the Department of Public Service, focusing on updating our street design guidelines and management guidelines for access management and transportation impacts. The Thoroughfare Plan is the first piece of that puzzle. So a little bit of background on the Thoroughfare Plan. The existing Thoroughfare Plan shown on this slide was adopted by City Council in 1993. So as you mentioned, it's quite outdated now. There have only been minor updates since then. There's a variety of classifications for different arterial streets throughout the city. Shown on this slide, there are diagrams of roadway designs here that were done, of course, many years ago, and associated rights-of-way with each of those. A little difficult to see on this slide, but the point to note here is all of these right-of-way designs are really just focused on vehicular moving travel lanes, not really accommodating other modes of transportation. And even adopted as part of the ordinance are specific pavement widths and the specific number of lanes. And again, that's focusing on how many vehicular travel lanes do we need. What we've realized through the years is as engineering and design best practices have evolved, some of these requirements actually don't apply anymore. They're not best practice anymore. So we have elements of the plan that really have become outdated, and we'd like to eliminate those items and remove that specificity that no longer applies. And as an example, this is State Route 161. It's designed to one of the classifications in the existing thoroughfare plan. It's a very wide multi-lane arterial roadway with service roads on either side of it. Most sections, when developed, did not provide for pedestrian or bicycle accommodation, although transit operates here, not really emphasized within the design of the roadway because that wasn't anticipated when the thoroughfare plan was developed. And this is an example of a roadway where we now, as a city, are going back and incrementally improving some of the safety and intersection design that we've realized has now become outdated. So why update the thoroughfare plan? Well, it's to accommodate those needs to update design best practices to eliminate some of those things that no longer apply, accommodate those changing travel demands that we see emerging in our system, and to accommodate multiple modes of transportation. Also, we, through the development process, have a number of cases where there have been exemptions to the right-of-way that's required in the thoroughfare plan, as we've gotten a better idea of how much space we actually need or is actually feasible to acquire and accommodate for street designs. And also different considerations of land use context. There are different roadway designs appropriate to more urban or suburban areas of the city that weren't really accommodated in the thoroughfare plan that we have. So how the thoroughfare plan works on a regular basis is in a couple of ways. It guides our capital improvements planning process in terms of providing the amount of right-of-way that the city may need to acquire for a new project that's being built by the city. It also guides how much right-of-way we may need to acquire through the private development process through rezonings, primarily as development has happened over the years. Then the amount of right-of-way that we might need for the roadway improvement to accommodate that new development is acquired during the development process. And there's also a close relationship between the zoning code and the thoroughfare plan. For most of our zoning districts, the front setbacks for where the buildings can be located on properties, that's actually based on the width of the thoroughfare right-of-way designated in the plan. And some other elements of that relationship between the zoning code and the thoroughfare plan, we have throughout the city a number of urban commercial overlays shown in pink on this slide. Those are the areas where we have a historical tight urban development pattern. Buildings are close to the street, and the zoning overlays are intended to continue that pattern of development, and that really reflects the limited amount of right-of-way we have in these older areas of the city, and that really wasn't accommodated or thought through with the original thoroughfare plan. And that means we have constraints in some areas where we do have that urban condition where it's going to be difficult to continually expand to accommodate additional capacity in the roadway, although there still may be opportunities for curbside improvements, adding additional parking or additional streetscape or space for things like transit shelters or pedestrian accommodations in some of these streets as well. And we want to make sure that the thoroughfare plan still allows for those types of incremental improvements. So the structure of the new proposed multimodal thoroughfare plan, there are a variety of sections in the ordinance. This is redefining how we're thinking about our roadway classifications in terms of moving people through a variety of modes. There is a map that we have on an easel here that's a visual representation of a large table of all of the arterial roadways throughout the city with the specification of its corridor type and the associated right-of-way and context within the city. This is setting up the procedures for how we can go about developing our design guidelines in the future to accommodate those changing needs within different rights-of-way and different corridor types, and really providing that greater flexibility in terms of roadway design, understanding that those things will change over time. So this is a representation of the map. This is available on the Department of Public Service website for further review, and it is showing in these various different colors, different classifications of corridors. One thing to point out here, it's somewhat apparent on this map through the line weights here that we're recognizing in our historic urban core of the city there will be minimal opportunity for very wide expansions of rights-of-way. So some of our right-of-way widths are fairly set. We may have some ability to acquire additional right-of-way. And then as we move into the more suburban, newer portions of the city where we tend to have larger rights-of-way, we have a little bit more space. And so each of those classifications is outlined in a long table of all of those arterial roadways, and that's where the specific right-of-way needs for each corridor are identified. And this is just a graphic example of the intent behind this more generalized approach to classifying the corridors, is recognizing that within any given amount of right-of-way, the design of the roadway can take a variety of forms, responding to different development contexts, development densities, and the specific transportation needs in different areas of the city. So we may have primarily auto-oriented streets in a certain corridor. Today, as development changes over time, the needs of that transportation system may change. There may be opportunities to reconfigure roadways to add additional, say, bicycle and micromobility facilities within the right-of-way. In some areas that may be a transit focus, which may happen through additional right-of-way, additional lanes, or through reconfiguring the lanes that we have in the right-of-way today. And in a number of areas that will include a combination of all of these different modes and facility types. And just as an example, this is Summit Street in the University District. The top image is from about 4 years ago. This top image is the design of the roadway per the existing thoroughfare plan. But as most people know, a few years ago, the city went through a design process and reconfigured the lanes on this roadway and added the protected bicycle cycle track. That's a design that technically doesn't meet the standards of our existing thoroughfare plan, but it does advance the mobility needs of the community. And another example going through the design process today is Hudson Street in Linden. Here's an image of Hudson today. And how the right-of-way is allocated today. There are sidewalks here, but not much accommodation for bicycle travel, and going through design processes, adding a shared use path that will accommodate cyclists and pedestrians and provide a greater amenity for the neighborhood, also provide safer turning movements in the design of the roadway. Again, a type of roadway design that wasn't anticipated in the thoroughfare plan that we have today. And so as we think about how this different way of thinking about roadway design fits into the context of the thoroughfare plan, a lot of this is anticipating the evolving needs of our transportation system as we do have additional development in the city, as we see some of our more suburban portions of the city become more urban over time with infill development. In the example that you see here, a typical suburban development pattern may over time evolve into something that is accommodating a wider variety of transportation modes as the development really reinforces the ability to move people in different ways. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for that testimony. So I just have a few questions before we roll into public testimony. You mentioned that our current plan only provides provision for vehicular travel. So when creating this new plan that is on the agenda, what other modes of transportation were considered?
So a wide variety of modes, definitely understanding the likely demands for transit within the variety of corridors, looking at the high frequency system that Dakota has today and their plans for additional high frequency lines in the future. Obviously looking closely at the potential impacts of enhancements associated with implementing the corridor concept study. We're really at the beginning of that process as a city and a region with understanding exactly how high-capacity transit might be accommodated in any of those studied corridors or other corridors. And as we move through that more detailed next steps of planning and design, that's going to better inform exactly how rights of way might be designed in different corridors. So there may be adjustments in the future to accommodate those specific needs. Also, of course, looking at the bicycle network that we have in place today, and as we look to the next steps of updating our bicycle network plans, filling the gaps that we have throughout the system, and making sure that we're providing enough right-of-way in the thoroughfare plan to accommodate different types of facilities. In some areas, that might be additional on-street facilities, bike lanes, or things like 7th Street. In other areas, likely through things like what I just showed with Hudson Street, a shared use path that's outside of the street curb, but accommodating a variety of roadway users in what we call active transportation. So thinking about bike lanes aren't just accommodating bikes anymore, and now they're accommodating scooters and whatever the next new mode of personal transportation might be emerging into the market, and making sure that we're thinking through those different types of modes, that we may design streets in a variety of different ways as we have new modes entering and providing more options to citizens.
And you kind of touched on my next question. Does this plan complement or conflict with the other initiatives that have been discussed? So we've thrown out Insight 2050, corridor concepts, MORPC's initiatives, as well as the pop-up share that is a road initiative that's happening right now for the next 2 weeks.
Absolutely. The intent behind this update is to complement all of these various initiatives that are ongoing, and it's part of the reason that it's taken some time to get to this point of advancing this updated thoroughfare plan, because as I mentioned earlier, so many initiatives have been ongoing over the past few years. We understood as a department that we needed to take a pause to let things like Smart Columbus get a foothold and start to establish where some of these new mobility demands are headed. As we incorporate more technology into the transportation system and think about how connected and autonomous vehicles may be changing the needs of our infrastructure, and things like the e-scooters that have entered the market. The Corridor Concepts initiative, definitely we understand that in a number of our roadway rights-of-way, we have to think differently about how we're accommodating transit. In some areas, that means we need more right-of-way in the future, and it also means that in some of our urban areas, we have to think differently about the right-of-way that we have.
How does the thoroughfare plan work with existing businesses and new development? So you touched on it a little bit, but I think it's key where we've got those urban constraints, and you've got places that are already established, arterial lanes that are already established. How do we get in line with the new plan?
Mm-hmm. So in a couple of ways, one of the things we've tried to do, I've alluded to, I guess, a couple of times, but to be clear, we have adjusted a number of the right-of-way widths designated in the thoroughfare plan to try to better reflect the reality on the ground and the practices that we've already been going through over the past number of years. I mentioned that there is an exemption process that's already provided for in the existing thoroughfare plan. What we've learned over the years is that exemption process is used pretty routinely in the older urban areas of the city where it's simply not feasible to add another 30 or 40 feet of right-of-way where we have building lines established along the roadway. A number of exemptions are very standard already. We've also realized that not every exemption should be provided without a thorough review of the specific needs in those portions of the corridor. So part of this will play out through the development review process and sitting down with developers on a case-by-case basis and making sure that we're thinking through all of the needs within the right-of-way to better serve that development and the rest of the corridor. So it may be the case that we know we will never get 20 feet to add 2 new travel lanes to a roadway, but there may be an opportunity to sit down with the developer and work out maybe there's an additional 5 or 10 feet that could expand the sidewalk, provide room for street trees or transit shelters or things like that without having a really expansive impact on the actual development capacity of the site, and actually could be a benefit and an amenity to the project. So this will really involve close coordination with individual developments and making sure that there's a good coordination in the design of the private site and the public right-of-way. And in the more suburban areas, making sure that we're still providing for enough space to provide for a multimodal shared use path. We have a number of cases where we simply don't have the right-of-way available to fit in a pedestrian accommodation or a bicycle accommodation, and it becomes very expensive in the future. So as we can, as development happens in those areas, making sure we're providing that space. So in our urban areas, a number of the thoroughfares, actually, we've lowered the amount of right-of-way that we're seeing as the designated minimum in the thoroughfare plan. And that will also have likely a positive impact on developments by narrowing that setback requirement that's associated with the width of the right-of-way. So the narrower the right-of-way, the narrower the setback in those urban areas. That's really what our zoning overlays are trying to achieve in the first place.
And new projects that are currently being developed right now, are they going through this similar review process that we're just now talking about?
In many ways, yes. There are aspects of what we're building into the thoroughfare plan ordinance now that are formalizing some processes that have kind of evolved over the years. So in a number of ways, we're trying to reflect our development review process that has been put in place and make sure that it's standardized.
Okay. So there is a strategic approach, right?
That's the intent, yes.
Okay, all right, wonderful. If we could go back to that Summit Street example for the audience. So you noted that in the Summit example, I think we passed it.
Am I going the wrong way?
There we go.
Yes.
These changes were made a couple years ago?
About 3 years ago?
About 3 years ago. And so technically, they would not be in line with the thoroughfare plan as presented today.
Well, with the existing adopted thoroughfare plan.
Okay.
What was implemented a few years ago is not a type of street design that was really recognized as even possible when our existing thoroughfare plan was developed many years ago.
So this, as it is now, it would be okay?
As it is now, this is a good example of a type of street design that our new multimodal thoroughfare plan would anticipate and encourage. It's an example of being creative with the amount of right-of-way that we already have, accommodating another mode of transportation without actually needing to acquire more space. It also reflects growing best practice for thinking differently about how wide our travel lanes need to be. And that's one of those things that's actually adopted or recognized in the current ordinance that we have. It's specifying the exact pavement width that we need, and that's based on an assumption of wider travel lanes than we understand to be best practice today.
For those who are unfamiliar with Summit, I never make assumptions. Can you talk about the importance of each of these different layouts here?
Mm-hmm. So on the top slide here, Summit Street, at one time, it's a one-way urban thoroughfare. It's also a state route. US 23 is noted on the slide. It was classified as a one-way, three-lane corridor, parking on both sides, and through a thorough traffic analysis and street design process, a number of design configurations were explored with reconfiguring Summit Street, and the city realized that we could move the same amount of traffic with one less travel lane, still provide on-street parking, and provide a two-way protected bicycle thoroughfare as well. So we're efficiently moving the same amount of traffic, but also moving more people and another mode through that reconfiguration. And still accommodating on-street parking as well.
And I can imagine that initially there may have been some pushback from users.
There's always concern with reconfiguring roadways. That's a constant process of engaging neighborhoods and different stakeholders, and that's an important part of the design process for any roadway redesign, is making sure that all of the alternatives are thoroughly vetted and communicated out to neighborhoods, and that will continue to be important in the future as well.
How has the department worked with external partners, including residents and stakeholders, to develop this plan?
At the beginning of the Connect Columbus planning process a few years ago, about the same time that the Summit Street design was moving through its process, there was a wide variety of community outreach performed. The project team had what was called a plan van that actually went around the city and met people in different parts of the city in their neighborhoods. There were a variety of public meetings held throughout the city in different locations, multi-day community workshops to provide information about the existing state of the transportation system and to get direct feedback from people. What are the types of things that people would like to see in the future evolution of our transportation system? And one of the things that we heard consistently was a desire for more options, for increased access and efficiency of the transit system, and better bicycle connections. And so those are things that have really permeated this planning process and influenced the type of thoroughfare plan that we're proposing today.
How can residents and community partners view the plan and or get involved with Connect Columbus and other future developments as it relates to the thoroughfare plan?
So the proposed thoroughfare plan is available for review on the Department of Public Service website at columbus.gov/public-service/connect-Columbus. And we'll send out a public notice, and we can put it on social media as well to make sure people have access to that information that's online.
It's also available on Legistar through City Council's website.
That's right. And we're happy to take any direct comments that members of the public might have, and we can, if not already, we can make sure that there's an option on the website. In fact, there is a Connect Columbus direct email, so citizens who have specific comments can use that, and we'll be able to review them.
And I know that you hit on this a couple times through, but through your presentation, but why is this update to our thoroughfare plan important?
For a couple of reasons. One is, as I mentioned, there are various elements of the thoroughfare plan that we have that really no longer apply. So we have some elements of the thoroughfare plan that are technically adopted by ordinance that aren't really reflecting best practice in roadway design. So we'd like to reflect what the city actually is doing in a lot of cases to implement best planning and engineering design of our roadway system, and provide that flexibility within the thoroughfare plan to accommodate those changing needs that we know that are happening very rapidly.
Okay. And what are the next steps once, if the plan is approved by council?
If the plan's approved by council, then that really provides us the opportunity to move forward and standardize and formalize some of those development review processes that I mentioned earlier, and make sure that as we're going through our review process, we're doing that consistently in a predictable way for every project developer. So we're getting consistent outcomes in how we're acquiring right-of-way or utilizing right-of-way that's acquired through the development review process. And then, as I mentioned on one of the slides earlier, there are a number of follow-on next steps that within the Department of Public Service will be advancing development of our updated street design guidelines, what we're calling our mobility management guidelines, so providing more guidance for access management, and our transportation impact studies process that also makes sure that we're getting all of those necessary roadway improvements that are providing for the demands on the system with new development. So those are follow-on housekeeping items, and then also there are some associated code updates that we'll be bringing back to council as we work with other departments. Some of those will be making sure that that relationship between the zoning code and the setback requirements and the thoroughfare plan, there may be some minor housekeeping items that need to be addressed there. We've had some discussions about those as well. And then as we move through the next phases of planning that low impact, low stress bicycle and active transportation network, there will be some code items to update related to how that gets implemented with new development as well.
Okay. Mr. Goodwin, thank you for your testimony. We will now move forward with our public testimony portion. When everyone had an opportunity to turn in a speaker slip, when your name is called, you'll have 3 minutes. There will be a timer that'll pop up on the screen. Upon the conclusion of your 3-minute time, there's a soft reminder that your time is up. So we'll move forward now. Anouk Moritz? I apologize if I mispronounced. Anouk? And please just state your name, and if you represent an organization, you can come on up to the podium. Absolutely.
Okay, my name is Muji Lai. And
I'm Anouk Moritz.
Okay. Just talk into the mic.
Okay. We participated in a smart transportation design challenge this year at school. We're students of CCS, Columbus City Schools, and we would like to share with you today our ideas from this challenge. So in 2016, an average of 102 people died every day due to traffic collisions. 1/3 of all U.S. air pollution is caused by vehicles, which makes it the largest contributor to global warming in the United States. Ohio's highways are carrying more than 6 times the weight they are supposed to be carrying. For the sake of our safety and all of that to earth, these problems are needing to be addressed by solutions to biking. So this is our plan to fix the problems that I stated above of our car-centric culture, broken down into 3 steps. Our first was to design a bike share system to improve accessibility. Our second was to add protected bike lanes to improve biker safety and mobility. And the third, of course, was to educate about the benefits of said biking and traffic laws and infrastructure, so that the people actually use our systems instead of just passing them by. So the existing bike share systems are 2 that you might know. KOGO, which is the docked biking system. And the system is not really built for the residents because the stations are limited and they are not all over the city, preventing accessibility. They are exclusively in Short North and downtown. The second is Lime Bike, which is a pilot program in 3 neighborhoods in Columbus. Lime Bike is an independent program, therefore it is not well integrated into our city. Our bike share system is basically like KOGO in the sense that we have stations near bus stops so that you can combine busing and biking to get where you need to go quickly. Having bikes at bus stops would also make sure that they are accessible to all of Columbus and not just certain neighborhoods. Bikes would have to be replaced at the stop at the end of your allotted time.
My name's Anouk Moritz, and I'm here to finish the presentation. Our second part of our plan is actually having bike infrastructure to support the bikes. And, the current infrastructure in Columbus is limited to 110 miles of bike paths, which are mostly scenic routes, so it's not very handy for residents. And then about 1.5 miles of protected bike lanes on Summit Street, and then some lanes on streets like High Street where you can share a lane with a car, but that isn't very safe or pleasant for riders. So to improve this, and to make sure that Columbus residents can actually get to where they need to go on bikes and do so safely, we propose adding protected bike lanes on important roads like High Street, Indianola, Broadway, Broad Street, Cleveland Avenue, Bethel Road, and Morse Road. These are all fairly broad roads, which allows space for adding a protected bike lane, and they're all very important thoroughfares, so it would be very useful for bikers. How we could actually protect these protected bike lanes is to protect with installing guardrails or adding planters between the bikes and cars, and also painting the bike path a different color so it automatically stands out from the rest of the road. In cases where protected bike lanes aren't sufficient, like on Henderson, a separate bike path or an overhead bridge or path can be added. Last year, Columbus was ranked as the 39th bike-friendliest city, which is pretty good, but its scores for bike safety and accessibility were barely over 50%. This plan to implement a better bike share system and the bike lanes to support it would bring these scores to a solid A. The third and final step to our plan is to inform everyone about the resources and the infrastructure, the safety precautions, and the traffic laws of biking. This would be done through programs in schools where students can learn about precautions such as wearing your helmet when you're biking or what to do in certain traffic situations, social media and TV campaigns, which reaches a broad audience, and through public announcements and celebrity endorsements, which would encourage people to do so. And putting in bikes and paths is only part of the solution. To actually fix the problems we set out to solve, people need to use this infrastructure and the bikes. That concludes our three-part plan to use bikes. No fancy tech or bigger highways to counteract the problems caused by an overload of cars. This includes global warming, overwhelming traffic, overused highways, and those 37,230 deaths in 2016 caused by traffic accidents. Turning to bikes won't immediately fix everything, but it will be so much better than continuing to turn to the source of these problems, cars. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. Well, and first of all, thank you for being so well prepared to provide your feedback on today's plan. But let me ask the two of you as young people, what do you see as the greatest barrier for individuals transitioning from relying on cars to moving towards biking?
I think currently the problem is that there's not enough infrastructure, but also weather can be a major problem. Like, no one wants to bike in the winter when it's snowing in Ohio. And also just commute times, which is why combining busing and biking would make it a little more easier for people to adjust to using bikes and public transport to get to places.
Thank you. Do you have any? Oh, yes, please.
Sorry. Going to add on to that, I think that some people have a perception about like public transportation, and I think that putting the bikes with the buses would make it, that would eliminate the excuse of, I cannot dock my bike where I need to be going. So the busing would definitely help with around the city and everything.
Wonderful. Mr. Goodwin or anyone at the table, do you have any comments or feedback?
Well, first I have to note that I did combine biking and busing today, so you're onto something there. It's a great way to commute. And if you have that option, definitely we would encourage that. I think we have some future transportation planners here, which is exciting. So yeah, thank you very much for your well-thought ideas here, and a number of things that you've described here I can say that are already on our radar in the Department of Public Service. And the planning and design process takes some time. As we mentioned with Summit Street, that wasn't done overnight, but I can't say that a number of the specific corridors that you mentioned we've had conversations about, and again, it'll take a while to go through design processes and, as we balance all of the various needs in different roadways, but we're really excited to work on these next steps of improving biking in Columbus. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
All right, well, the bar is now high. Mr. Tim Lai?
Okay.
Welcome.
Welcome. Council Member Favor, Mr. Goodwin, and the staff of the Public Service Department, good evening. My name is Tim Lai. I'm an architect. I'm father of Muji Lai, just did a great job. But also, I'm also a concerned citizen. So today I would like to speak about my concern about the disconnect between the zoning code regarding parking requirement and the different mode of transportation available now and in the near future. It is especially true in some of the older and more established part of our city like Lindenville. The current zoning code and its various overlay exceptions are convoluted to most people except a few zoning attorneys, planners, and design professionals like myself. While many of the zoning code concerned parking requirements are originally perceived with good intention, there are many unintended consequences, and they're not only detrimental to the more robust urban transformation into a more bike and pedestrian-friendly environment, they also divide the neighborhood into pro-parking and pro-development groups, pitting neighbors against each other. And I've witnessed those firsthand many times. They created unreasonable hardship and burden for small businesses and entrepreneurs to grow and invest in our community, especially those in the food and beverage businesses, which contribute greatly to the walkability of our commercial streets. So these codes are outdated in the face of many new transportation options that we talk about today, like bike share, ride share, electric scooter, and more frequent bus services, especially in the local and the neighborhood level where travel distances are short. The problem is that our addiction to free parking and our overdependence on vehicular transportation, which is never really free. A 2,000 square feet of coffee shop requires 27 parking spaces and about 10,000 square feet of asphalt paving, 5 times more than the actual space it serves. We come to expect free parking everywhere we go at the cost of cutting down trees, reducing green spaces, and patio seating for actual human beings' social interactions. The parking requirement does not encourage it, it mandates it. The same asphalt paving that create heat island effects, which contribute to global warming and other environmental impacts. The result is that on average, for every car in the city, there are 8 service parking spaces for it. MOPSI estimates that the total population can reach 3 million people in 2050. We cannot afford to just focus on parking for cars in every new and adaptive change of use cases. It's time for our city official to look at the current zoning code closely regarding the parking requirement in different parts of the city with very different needs. We need to consult with local community leaders, business, property owners, and design professionals. And of course, we need a sensible zoning ordinance to manage our built environment, but many of the commercial overlays has been in place for more than 10 years without any changes. They need to be reviewed carefully and sensibly to make sure that they're smart and conducive for future of Columbus that is viable socially, economically, and environmentally. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. So just we deal with parking all the time, being the chair of Public Service and Transportation. And so this is a conversation that we have frequently. And, you know, I believe, well, I know as a growing city, that's something that we're taking into consideration with every development project that comes our way, and specifically even with this thoroughfare plan. But aren't we also talking about a change of perspective for actual residents to start thinking differently about what transportation looks like? And so, you know, a few years ago, where Columbus was not as active as it was, and we didn't have all this growth, and it's a quick shift, right, where people could have 2.5 cars and be okay and be able to move quickly about the city. But we are, as residents of Columbus, we're going to have to, I guess, take that initiative to start thinking about transportation differently. How do you think we can start to do that?
Well, I think we're already doing it. I mean, we have a lot of options, obviously, especially, like I said, in a very local neighborhood levels. You know, there's bike, there is COGO, there is electric scooters. And the problem is that, and people actually want that in a lot of these more established neighborhood that has very limited space in terms of the parking lot and the building that is existing, that historically, you know, those are maybe offices or retail space that, you know, the demand is not there for those uses. And people are telling us that, you know, opportunity economically is to transform a lot of those places into a drinking and eating places that people enjoy in the neighborhood, that make the commercial corridor more walkable and more lively. But the problem is that the zoning code is not, you know, it's not compatible with that. And so what happened is that at the local hearing on different levels, you know, the resident would basically take out the zoning code and say, hey, look, this is what you're supposed to do, which is, you know, you're supposed to provide that many parkings for a very limited space. And if you can't do that, then you're creating a problem for the neighborhood, right? But then on the other hand, people will say, well, we don't need all this parking because we can walk, we have street parking, we have different way that we can get to different places very quickly. And they create for me, I think it creates a lot of needed tension within the community that we need to address. And I think part of the problem is that people don't understand the burden of so-called parking problem is not solely rest on business owners and property owner, but part of that is a city planning issue. It's a city planning failure that it does not take into consideration of the need and the way that we can actually share parking. Like I said, there's 8 parking spaces for every car. Because we're not very good in sharing those existing parking, service parking that we already have. And there's no infrastructure, there's no incentive for people to do that. And I think that's another thing that we should look at as on the macro levels to be able to facilitate that, you know, in a more conducive way.
Thank you so much for your comments. Anyone want to respond, or?
You're certainly describing a issue that is getting a lot of attention throughout the city. I think everyone within the city and our various different departments, including the Department of Development, not here at this table, are well aware. I think on our end, one of the things that I mentioned in our presentation is this highlights that need to think about transportation demand differently and more holistically. And that connection between land use and transportation, it doesn't just impact how we design the right-of-way, but it impacts the capacity of development and the ability to change uses over time. And that reinforces that need for our different disciplines to work closely together as we think about the needs in these different neighborhoods.
Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Ms. Catherine Gervis with Yay Bikes.
Thank you, Councilmember Favor, for inviting us here tonight. My name is Catherine Gervis, and I'm with Yay Bikes. We are excited about the interest of the various community leaders within the City of Columbus, the elected leadership, those within the Department of Public Service, the business and social service communities, who understand the importance of encouraging people to travel less alone in a car and instead use sustainable and equitable forms of transportation more. We at Yay Bikes look forward to reviewing the Connect Columbus legislation and are excited about and hopeful about seeing an increased investment in the resources, particularly right-of-way, that support biking and other equitable and sustainable modes of transportation. There are a variety of reasons this is good for our community, even for those who are never going to ride a bike, including improved health outcomes, increased productivity of workers and students, improved environmental outcomes, increased safety of travelers, and better access to our most marginalized residents. We know that creating significant mode shift for bikes is directly related to creating low-stress bicycle networks that increase safety, comfort, and connectivity. I want to speak for a moment about safety. Between 2013 and 2017, a total of 196,792 crashes were reported within the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission's planning area, involving 498,131 people. Of those, 528 were fatally injured, and 4,323 suffered serious injuries. Put another way, in the approximate area of Franklin and Delaware County, an average of 273 people were involved in a crash every day for 5 years. More than 2 people a day, every day for 5 years, experienced a life-altering crash. This is not just about people on bikes. According to a comprehensive study published in the Journal of Transport and Health, we know that creating separated and protected bike infrastructure is not only good for people who ride bikes, but in communities that prioritize separated and protected bike infrastructure, injury rates were halved, and not just for cyclists, but for all road users, including drivers. We see safer streets when we create infrastructure that supports that as a mode of transportation. We also need to think about the people in our community who can't afford to own, maintain, and operate a car. We have census tracts in our community that have car ownership rates as low as 34%. This really is about equity. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And if you could, just for our listening audience, because you are quite the bike advocate, I had my first ride in downtown with Ms. Gervis not too long ago during one of the busiest times of the day, around lunchtime. And she had me on Broad Street, High Street. I thought we were going to just go for a little luxury ride. and I was sweating the entire time. So if you could just talk briefly about Yay Bikes and how important that type of advocacy is for Columbus.
So Yay Bikes really focuses on transportation riding, and we do that through education and advocacy. We're very interested in helping people figure out how to get from one point to another given the current conditions. We know, as Mr. Goodwin mentioned, that there is a long window. Once we have the public will to move in a particular direction, it can take time to get there. And we know that it is possible through training that people can learn to get from one place to another using a bike safely and comfortably. But we also know that 60% of the population is interested in using a bike for some trip they're currently making in some other way, or some trip that they don't feel able to make. And so advocating for that population of people to be able to travel in their preferred mode is another part of the work we do.
Wonderful. Mr. Goodwin, is this the type of information that was considered as you thought through the thoroughfare plan, excuse me?
Absolutely. Everything that Ms. Gervais mentioned here is well in our minds in the Department of Public Service. The safety issues, the increasing number of crashes that we're seeing for vulnerable roadway users of all types, including cyclists, but just pedestrians as well. It's a growing national trend, and it's something that needs extensive attention, and that can take place through a variety of changes to how we design streets, and think differently about how we control and manage speed. That's a big part of the severity of crashes, is how fast vehicles are traveling. We know that a collision between a vehicle and a vulnerable roadway user at or above 35 miles per hour can be fatal. And so one of the things that we focus on is traffic calming and speed management, and looking for ways that we can reduce the desire of motorists to travel faster than they should be by law, and that's related to design. And I mentioned, just as an example, the widths of our travel lanes that historically have been wider than we now realize are needed. And there's a direct correlation between lane width and the typical speed of vehicles. So there are even little incremental things we can do to continue to improve our roadways to manage speed and mitigate safety issues. And that's one example. There are a variety of more extensive design and reconfiguration processes that we're going through on a regular basis to improve the safety of the system.
Thank you, and thank you for your
Thank you.
advocacy. Next up, we have Mr. Mark Corral. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Favor. I just want to start out by saying, thank you to Mr. Goodwin and your colleagues for the presentation. I really, on a whole, I think this plan is great. I'm so happy to see that Columbus is taking a big step into the future and into seeing that we need to give people the ability to get around our city without requiring the use of a car, like we do in so many parts of it today. I was also really happy to hear you talk about speed and the design considerations. That's a big concern of mine in terms of, people have the expectation that, I should be able to go, 45 miles an hour right through the city and never have to slow down, and then that's what, where you get people being killed. A couple things I just wanted to sort of bring up to urge that these be priorities as going forward as these plans get sort of fleshed out, and as we get into specifics of road design, is that I think we should be bold when we're especially looking at some of these major corridors. That there have been a lot of improvements here and there that I've seen over the past few years. We've had, more rapid bus routes. We've had, we're having some bus lane pilots. There are new bike lanes, but a lot of those are very incremental. They're very, and a painted bike lane isn't going to get a lot of people to really try commuting that way, just like a bus that may come more often but still takes an hour to get where somebody could get in 20 minutes in a car isn't necessarily going to be enough to change the way that they get where they're going. I think something like full bus rapid transit is amazing because you have, dedicated right-of-ways, you have traffic signal priority, you have great stations where you pay before you get on the bus. I mean, something like that could be a real game changer. Something like a protected bike lane network is something that says it's really more attractive for people to try to not just exist in their cars. And then also I think intersections and crosswalks, while we're looking at these, the layout of our streets, I think it's important to also set standards to say, if we have a street, what's the maximum distance we're going to go without a marked crosswalk, and what are the standards we can put in place, like bulb outs and bump outs or raised crosswalks or signals, because it can be hard in a lot of parts of the city just to cross the street, and you have to, even if you have the right of way, you really have to be bold if you're going to actually try to do it in a lot of places because people just don't want to stop.
Thank you so much. You bring up a very good point, and I've heard it mentioned quite a bit. Do you think, and this is to Mr. Goodwin, do you believe that this thoroughfare plan is bold and aggressive enough to accommodate these different modes of transportation that are coming to Columbus, that we're inviting to come into Columbus to solve our transportation woes?
I think that it is, but I want to stress that there are a lot of additional pieces, and Mr. Corral alluded to this, the next steps and more detailed efforts that need to move forward. I mentioned earlier as an example, advancing the update to street design guidelines. That's where a lot of these very specific elements related to, say, speed management and safety and intersection design, the devil's always in the details. So what we're doing with the thoroughfare plan is providing a high-level framework. There are a number of other operating procedures, manuals, more specific rules, regulations, policies to be fleshed out as we move forward that will really provide those details of how things get implemented in design on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
Next, we have Mr. David Slobey. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, Councilmember Favor and other members and guests. My name is Dave Slobey, and I represent the Aubrey Road Corridor Commission, which consists of Asherton Grove, Linden Chase, Preston Commons, Rolling Ridge, and Lee Aubrey Homeowner and Condo Associations. The handout, if you have it, okay, is what I'm going to speak on. We're asking your help and consideration to install an additional 5,035 linear feet of sidewalks and multi-use trails, primarily along Aubrey and Central College roads, in an effort to unite approximately 22 communities with walking and bike access to the new community park that is currently being built at the corner of Aubrey and Warner Roads. You can see the park is outlined in red. The side of the park that stretches north, in this case, has multi-use trails that goes up to Central College Road. The problem is, on this map, you see where the yellow is showing, that does not have any multi-use trails and or sidewalks. So in order to walk along that path, you're either walking in the street or on grass or biking on grass or in the street. We have submitted this plan to the Northland Community Council, and we have their complete support. This would provide the following benefits. One, all 22 communities will be united via sidewalks and multi-use trails. Two, the communities themselves currently have about 138,598 feet of existing sidewalk and or trails. And what we are asking is only 3.6% of all of that. It's a very small amount when you look at it percentage-wise to look as to make it all complete. Installing these along Central College Road and completing the northern tip of Aubrey Road will allow for a walking bike loop from this new park all the way around without having to go across any major streets. Number 4, completing this installation will also bring these residents to close proximity of the new Hamilton Quarter project that is currently being built on the north end of Hamilton, right there by 161. And most importantly, we believe this will complete this section of the Columbus community and would be used as an example on how to unite other communities. So we would like your approval to begin this project or include it in your project scope so it can be scheduled and reasonably completed along with the new park. And we are very welcome to and willing to work with you on this endeavor. And that is it.
Thank you. Thank you for your commentary. I'll kick it over to Public Service. We generally have a nice list of sidewalk improvements. We have, I think just as recent as this past Monday, legislated our third round of pavings. And so I'm not sure if this one is in the pipeline. I would love to sit down and have a more detailed conversation offline about what the group's perspective is, but absolutely.
Likewise, we're happy to take this back and review it against our list of projects that are in the pipeline. I don't believe any of the specific lines drawn here are in the immediate pipeline, but not to say that they can't be analyzed and added into a program. There are some other shared use paths in the general area that are going through a design process now, Little Turtle Way and portions of Old 161, for example, which would be opportunities to connect into some of the system that you're describing as well.
Thank you, because what we are experiencing out there north of the Hamilton Quarter is hundreds, literally hundreds of new development for housing and new people, and everybody wants to walk, wants to bike, wants to get around. And this would just be the most opportune time to complete a section and be done with it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, we have Mr. Ron Halta? Is there a Ron here? Lives on Black Street? Okay, please let the record reflect. And then lastly, we have David Roseman. Welcome.
Welcome. Dear Columbus Council Member Favor, Chair, Associates, City Staff, and guests, I'm David Roseman, 40-year resident of Columbus, Northland. I'm a bicycling, pedestrian, active transportation advocate, volunteer, and Ohio environmental activist. I was one of the founders of the Central Ohio Bicycling Advocacy Coalition, COBAC, which rebranded as Consider Biking, and now there's Yay Bikes. I'd routinely participated with Columbus Bicycling Subcommittee for many years, plus Morpsey, Greenways, Metro Parks, CODA Bus Rapid Transit Task Force, Northland Community Council, and other community-based bicycling advisory, active transportation-related groups, committees, and stakeholders. While it's great to see a new multi-modal thoroughfare proposed plan, I'm rather disappointed that after several years of much staff time, multiple meetings, hundreds of thousands of dollars spent by Columbus for consultants, it seems that a full Connect Columbus plan has either been scrapped or not publicly shared in total, and therefore not produced what we initially sought as deliverables. Where is the expected complete streets policy versus the old proclamation recommendations? And where's the new Columbus Master Bikeways plan as an update to the Bicentennial Bikeway Plan of 2008 that my group helped get Coleman and others, Mayor Coleman and others to adopt and carry out? Please, how can we renew the still needed critical specific initiatives? The Columbus, on other issues, the Columbus Transportation Pedestrian Commission, along with its bicycling subcommittee, where I and many other stakeholders regularly participated, was unceremoniously disbanded by Columbus Department of Public Services, DPS, several years ago. Those meetings provided a necessary communication forum for staff and public to transparently, proactively learn about and discuss city bike and ped ideas, needs, and plans. Why were those groups discontinued? How and when can they be renewed? Thanks to the Bicycling Subcommittee's encouragement, the City of Columbus DPS have begun to economically leverage some city roadway repaving opportunities to provide new pavement tread width on formal gravel shoulder for bike and ped travel where no sidewalks exist. However, the Columbus Department of Public Utilities revised stormwater manual curtailed DPS's expanded pavement initiative for various reasons. How may we provide a variance or exemption for city projects adding some bike and ped infrastructure within the public right-of-way travel corridor? In addition, our great large city is missing about 50% of sidewalks. Such huge gap places our pedestrians, children, transit users, commuters, and others in harm's way while encouraging unnecessary motor vehicle usage for especially short trips. The ongoing Columbus sidewalk capital budget remains extremely paltry, stagnant below $10 million. What can we do to boldly increase that perhaps tenfold? I look forward to the opportunity to follow up with you, your city council member, associates, city leaders, and staff. I hope you will personally champion to reengage some past priorities in order to provide a safer, efficient, expanded mobility options within Columbus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I will kick it over to Department of Public Service if you have any feedback or comments on Mr. Bowman's.
Roseman.
My apologies.
Well, Mr. Roseman touched on a lot of items there, and as always, happy to talk in more detail about a number of specific interests that you'd like to see advance. One of the items that you mentioned, you alluded to the long process that Connect Columbus has gone through. Again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of things have changed since that process began, and we've tried to take a step back and make sure we're being methodical. And I want to reiterate that what we're developing here with the proposed thoroughfare plan it's a first step of a number of other initiatives to be advanced. And you mentioned, for instance, updates to the bicycle network plan, the existing bicentennial bikeways plan, which is now 10 years old. We're well aware that it
11,
needs
yeah,
update. Yeah. And I alluded to this earlier. Some of those next steps are taking a more deliberate look at our active transportation and bicycle network planning in partnership with MORPC. We're having conversations about collaborating on some planning efforts that would advance that, and happy to talk with you more about that as we develop what that process is going to be. Just as an example, I mentioned street design guidelines and some of those other operating procedures, that those will be next steps to follow on from this point. So it's not just adopt this and we're done. There's always more work to do.
Understand, I've been around 40 years and I'm tried to deal with and work with the process, but some impatience is happening here, and we would appreciate City Council being aware of some of the history.
Absolutely.
And trying again to readopt some of the committees that had once were established, and to provide some more engagement with the public citizens, the community, city staff, City Council, because we feel that transparency unfortunately has disappeared.
I would welcome that conversation. We'll make sure that you have our information before you leave today.
Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you to the Department of Public Service and Transportation for your work on this plan. This effort is important to neighborhood vitality, sustainability, equitable access, health and safety, and economic development. I also want to thank everyone who has come out this afternoon to offer comments on this initiative. As chair of the Public Service and Transportation Committee, I look forward to continuing these conversations. As a reminder, there is a pop-up shared mobility lane that is currently being tested right now on 3rd Street between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. We welcome all comments, both good and bad. We want to know how folks feel about that concept, what fits right in line with this thoroughfare plan. So please, if you do not have our office's information, please grab a card, and I would love to have your feedback on that plan. And that concludes today's hearing. Thank you so much.